We're very, very happy to welcome online Dr. Emily Brennan. Yes, you're here. Welcome. Thank you for connecting. Emily Brennan is working in the Centre for Behavioural Research in Cancer Council Victoria in Melbourne, in Australia. And Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be joining you all from Australia today. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Cancer Council Victoria, which is a not-for-profit organisation that conducts research, cancer prevention programs, and provides support to people affected by cancer. As is customary in Australia, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous Australians, who are the traditional owners of the land that I live and work on. I offer my respect to their elders and to any Indigenous people who are present at the symposium today. Next. Today I will begin by describing the current and former Australian low-risk drinking guidelines, which are slightly different to others that we've heard about so far. I'll then spend most of the time describing a program of research we conducted between 2014 and 2021 to investigate the use of television advertisements to communicate and increase the impact of low-risk drinking guidelines. And towards the end, I'll briefly touch on some other examples of efforts to communicate guidelines. Next. First of all, in Australia, the guidelines refer to a standard drink, which is defined as containing 10 grams of pure alcohol. Next. Low-risk drinking guidelines in Australia are developed by the National Health and Medical Research Council, or NHMRC, which is an Australian government agency. Between 2009 and 2020, which is the period when our research was conducted, there were 4 guidelines. Guideline 1 recommended that healthy adults could reduce the long-term risk of harm by having no more than 2 standard drinks on any day. Guideline 2 recommended that healthy adults could reduce the immediate risk of injury by having no more than 4 standard drinks on a single occasion. Guideline 3 recommended that for those under the age of 18, not drinking is the safest option. And Guideline 4 recommended that for women who are planning pregnancy, who are pregnant, or who are breastfeeding, not drinking is the safest option. The guidelines were revised in 2020. And so under the current guidelines, Guideline 1 combines the recommendations to have no more than 10 standard drinks per week and no more than 4 standard drinks on any one day. It also advises that the less you drink, the lower your risk of harm. The guidelines related to children and pregnant women remained essentially the same, although the language was strengthened to advise that they should not drink alcohol. As in many other countries, there have been minimal national efforts to raise awareness of the Australian guidelines. And the most recent national data shows that although the number of people who drink at levels that exceed the current guidelines has gradually decreased over the past 20 years, around 1 in 4 people continue to drink at levels that exceed the guidelines, and that increase their risk of short and long-term harms. So now on to our research focused on communicating the low-risk drinking guidelines. This research was funded by a competitive grant from the NHMRC, which was awarded to Professor Melanie Wakefield and colleagues at Cancer Council Victoria, including myself, and other collaborators. I will note that although the NHMRC was the funder and they developed the guidelines, they were not involved in the research in any way. As in many other countries, we know that public awareness of the Australian guidelines is low. And so the aim of the research was to investigate whether television advertisements could be used to raise awareness and the impact of the guidelines. In particular, we were interested in the strategy of combining an ad that provides compelling information about why people should want to change their drinking behaviour with an end frame at the end of the ad that communicates the low-risk drinking guideline that will help them to avoid the harms described in the ad. We conducted 5 studies, and I will take you through the findings from each of these studies. Although before I move on, I will note that although I talk about television ads throughout this presentation, the media environment has changed significantly in Australia, as I'm sure it has in your countries too. And so in the current environment, these ads would also be seen online, on social media, and on streaming platforms. In the first study, we conducted an exhaustive search for all existing alcohol harm prevention television ads produced between 2006 and 2015. We required them to be in English, although they were sourced from many different countries. Having identified 110 eligible ads, we then conducted a content analysis of the characteristics of each ad. Just over half of the ads focused on short-term harms, and only 10% were about long-term harms. 38% aimed to get people to reduce their alcohol consumption, but notably only 10% of these ads included any mention of the low-risk drinking guidelines. The next study used 83 of these ads in an advertisement response rating study, which aimed to identify the most effective ads for achieving different outcomes. Just over 2,000 Australian adult drinkers were each exposed to 3 of the 83 ads, and each ad was rated by about 80 people. Participants rated each ad on several measures, but I will focus on findings for the extent to which each ad made them feel motivated to reduce the amount of alcohol they drink. On this motivation measure, the highest ranked ad was an Australian ad called Spread, which focused on the link between alcohol and cancer, and I will play this ad for you in just a minute. However, we also found that ads ranked in the 2nd to 7th positions did not score significantly differently on the motivation outcome, whereas those ranked in lower positions did have a significantly lower score compared to Spread. Another notable finding was that the relative rankings of the different ads was very similar when we looked at the subgroups of men and women, younger and older adults, and low risk and high risk drinkers. And specifically, Spread was also ranked in the number 1 or 2 positions within each audience subgroup, indicating that this ad had broad appeal. And so hopefully the ad will play for you now.
Alcohol is carcinogenic. Once absorbed into the bloodstream, it travels through the body. With every drink, the risk of cell mutations in the breast, liver, bowel, and throat increases. These cell mutations are also known as cancer. Stay at a low risk of alcohol-caused cancer and other diseases. Health experts recommend having no more than 2 standard drinks on any day. Alcohol. Think again.
When Spread first aired in 2010, an evaluation found that the campaign significantly improved knowledge of the guidelines and of the link between alcohol and cancer, and there was some evidence of a positive impact on intentions to drink less. In our research, we were also able to combine the data from the ad rating study with that from the previous content analysis to assess whether the ads that were most highly ranked had any characteristics in common. We found that ads that featured a why change message were more likely to be highly ranked compared to those with a how to change message. And ads that featured long-term harms and those that included a message about low-risk drinking guidelines were also more likely to be highly ranked. The next phase of our research focused on developing the end frame messages to communicate the guidelines. And so here again are the 2 2009 guidelines that we focused on in this study. We conducted 10 qualitative focus groups with people who drink and explored their responses to several messages designed to convey the long-term and short-term harm guidelines in a way that was clear, believable, and memorable. Each of these short text messages was accompanied by a voiceover that explained the guideline. The main aim of this study was to select the most promising end frame messages to use as part of the stimuli in the next experimental study, and the yellow boxes here indicate which messages were selected. Looking now at the experimental study, in which we tested the impact of combining the most effective television ads from study 2 with the most effective end frame messages identified in study 3. This was a between subjects online experiment with 6 conditions, including 2 control conditions. More than 3,000 Australian adults were each randomly assigned to 1 condition. Next. 4 ads depicted the short-term harms of drinking and 4 ads depicted long-term harms, and these included ads from Australia, New Zealand and the UK. And here's how those end-frame messages about the guidelines looked at the end of the ad, and you can see how the voiceover communicates the details of the guideline. So let's have a look at the results. I'm just presenting here the results for the long-term harm conditions, but the findings were very similar in the short-term harm conditions. The first outcome looked at whether participants knew how many drinks a person could have each day before they would put their health at risk, with the correct answer being no more than 2 drinks. If you focus on the bottom row, this shows that for drinkers exposed to the ads about long-term harms with the guideline message, 77% gave a correct estimate, and these participants were more likely to give a correct estimate and less likely to give either an overestimate or a don't know response compared to those in the other 3 conditions. So these findings indicated that the guidelines end frame resulted in more drinkers who understood the recommended drinking level, and that the end frame worked both by correcting misconceptions and for some by providing new information and thereby reducing don't know responses. Looking now at an outcome that measured intentions to reduce alcohol consumption in the next week, and again the results were very similar in the short-term harm conditions. So compared to those in the alcohol control condition who were exposed to ads for alcohol products, participants who viewed long-term harm ads with and without guidelines were both more likely to intend to reduce their drinking in the next week. The results were similar when compared to the control advertisements that were unrelated to alcohol. And notably, we also found that drinkers exposed to the long-term harm ads with the guidelines end frame were significantly more likely to intend to reduce their drinking compared to those who viewed the ads without the end frame. As part of this experiment, people were recontacted 1 week later. Using the follow-up data, we conducted a mediation analysis to explore whether the effect of exposure to the ads on future intentions and compliance with the low-risk drinking guideline over the past week was mediated through 2 outcomes of interest: correct estimates of harmful drinking levels and negative attitudes towards drinking. For these analyses, we limited the sample to those who were exposed to the long-term harm ads. And so in the second row there, this figure shows that exposure to long-term harm ads with the guidelines message increased the proportion of people who correctly estimated harmful drinking levels, and in turn, having a correct estimate strengthened intentions to drink less over the next month. And there was a significant indirect effect from exposure to intentions. Exposure to the long-term harm ads with the guidelines also increased negative attitudes towards drinking, which in turn also increased intentions to drink less. And it's not shown here, but there was a significant indirect effect of exposure to the guidelines through negative attitudes on having drank at a level that complied with the low-risk drinking guidelines over the past week. So bringing all of that together, the key insights from this program of research are that well-designed television ads that provide drinkers with compelling reasons to change their behaviour can be combined with end-frame messages that communicate low-risk drinking guidelines, and that these messages can increase awareness of harmful drinking levels, negative attitudes towards drinking, intentions to drink less, and in some cases, compliance with the low-risk drinking guideline. It is possible to use existing ads about the harms of alcohol and adapt the end frame to communicate low-risk drinking guidelines. And so the most important point here is that not every country or jurisdiction needs to be creating their own ads. This is a practice that we've seen used a lot in tobacco control, where ads developed in one country have then been adapted for use in several other countries. And there is evidence for the success of this approach. This is helpful as it can substantially reduce the time and financial investment required for countries to run effective campaigns for their own population. There are some impressive examples of real-world campaigns that have used this approach of providing information about the harms of drinking and about low-risk drinking guidelines in the same ad. And so this includes the Ravages campaign from the team at Santé, publique, France that we heard about earlier, which showed some really promising effects in the evaluation. And the Alcohol Think Again program in the state of Western Australia, which produced the spread ad back in 2010, has also made several other ads using this approach, which can all be found on their website. While I have focused today on the use of television ads focused on the harms of alcohol, there are, of course, other approaches to communicating low-risk drinking guidelines. Although I think it is important to note that considering how many countries have low-risk drinking guidelines and the number of deliberate efforts to communicate them is still very limited, as is the amount of research to investigate the most effective ways of communicating guidelines. However, there are a few examples of recent research in this area that I wanted to highlight. One is an evaluation of a campaign in Canada, which focused on getting the audience to think about their drinking patterns and their limits. And this found some promising results for increased awareness of the guidelines among women. At least one recent study has investigated the use of smartphone apps to raise awareness of guidelines among young people. And although this study found that use of the app did decrease alcohol consumption, it was not more effective than the control condition. And there is a growing number of studies focused on alcohol labels and various uses of alcohol labels. For example, a trial by Gold and colleagues in the UK tested various pictorial label messages that were specifically about the guidelines and found that they led to better knowledge and understanding of the low-risk drinking guidelines. And of course, the important study in Yukon, Canada, demonstrated that when alcohol warning labels, one of which focused on the guidelines, were implemented in the real world, there was evidence of increased knowledge of the low-risk drinking guidelines and, importantly, evidence of reduced alcohol consumption at the population level. There were very promising findings from that study. Okay, so that's all I have time for today. I hope that provides a helpful contribution to the conversation there today. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you have either now or please feel free to contact me by email. Thank you.